My name is Dr. Julian Adler. The ship's logs, if they are ever recovered, will likely note my dual role aboard the Odyssey, xenobiologist and mission psychologist. 2 hats for one head, but in the depths of space, specialization often yields to necessity. We were approaching Kepler 186f2, a planet unofficially, almost superstitiously, nicknamed Mirage. 6 long years in transit, 6 years of the hum of air recyclers and the sterile scent of processed water. I had almost forgotten what real Earth, real rain, smelled like. Our mission, on paper at least, was simple. Investigate the unique, inexplicable optical anomalies observed on Mirage's terminator, the perpetually shifting border between the scorching light of the local red dwarf and the profound darkness of its night side. The phenomena were bizarre. Data from long-range telescopes showed light distortions that defied known physics, as if reality itself was bending and refracting at this boundary. And of course, the secondary objective, ever present on such expeditions, the search for signs of life. Any life. Captain Isabel Corrigan led the briefing with the same calm competence that had made her a legend in the Explorer Corps. Yet even I, with my trained psychologist's eye, noticed the fine lines of fatigue around her eyes, the barely perceptible shadow in her usually steadfast gaze. This was her 5th long-haul voyage, and every such flight took a piece of the soul. She didn't mention it directly, but we all knew about the previous attempts. 2 automated probes, Pioneer 12 and Voyager X, had been sent to Mirage decades ago. Both vanished without a trace. Pioneer 12's transmissions cut off abruptly on its approach to the Terminator. The final seconds of the broadcast were filled with wild telemetry spikes and a burst of static through which, upon repeated listening, I thought I could hear a rhythmic, low-frequency hum. Voyager X lasted longer. It managed to transmit several data packets from low orbit before falling silent forever. The images were blurred, distorted by interference, but on them, at the very edge of the darkness, were structures. Unnaturally straight lines, angles that nature could not have created. The last clear image we managed to restore showed a fragment of something massive, dark, receding into the impenetrable shadow. Ruins? An outpost? It was impossible to say. But it was this frame, frozen on the main screen during the briefing, that sent a chill down my spine despite the comfortable temperature on the Odyssey's bridge. A distorted, nearly indecipherable view of something that should not have been there. Our objective is to approach, study, collect data, and return. Captain Corrigan's voice pulled me from my thoughts. We are not lone heroes. We are a science team. We operate strictly by protocol, no freelancing. Her gaze swept over us, over Declan Byrne, our chief engineer, whose hands could make a toaster work after a nuclear blast, but whose eyes held an old, deep pain. Over Annika Prasad, our communications specialist, young and brimming with an enthusiasm that was almost a vibration of anticipation. Over Kenji Sato, the head of our small security detail, whose stone-faced demeanor hid a mind as sharp as a razor. And over me. The thrill of discovery, sweet and sharp, warred within me with a subterranean anxiety. This was not just another celestial body. Mirage was calling, and its call was ancient, dark, and full of unspoken promises or threats. I tried to convince myself it was merely scientific curiosity, the thirst to solve a puzzle. But somewhere deep inside, where logic gave way to primal instinct, I felt it. This planet was not just a dead rock orbiting a distant star. It was waiting. The thrum of the Odyssey's engines faded, replaced by the almost inaudible vibration of life support systems as we settled into a stable orbit around Kepler 186f2, Mirage. Even from here, at an altitude of roughly 100 miles, the planet looked surreal, like something from the canvas of a mad abstract artist. One side, perpetually facing the crimson eye of its red dwarf, was a scorched desert. At least that's how it appeared through the dense, methane-rich atmosphere. The colors ranged from rust red to a sickly yellow, scarred by canyons that looked like wounds. The other side was absolute, impenetrable darkness, an ink blot where not a single star glimmered, swallowed by thick cloud layers or whatever else lurked there in the eternal night. But the most mesmerizing feature was the Terminator. This boundary between day and night was not a clean line, as on the Moon or Mars. It pulsed, shimmered, and writhed as if it were alive. Light and shadow waged an endless, bizarre war here. At times, it seemed as if giant, amorphous tentacles of darkness crawled onto the illuminated side, while at others, crimson rays of sun pierced the gloom, momentarily revealing vague, rapidly changing shapes. Mirages, yes. But these mirages had a sinister purposefulness to them, as if something were deliberately distorting reality at this border. Even through the high-resolution screens, the sight induced a slight vertigo and nausea, as if the brain refused to process such contradictory information. Incredible, isn't it, Doc? Annika Prasad's voice sounded beside me. She was pressed against the viewport, her young face glowing with a mixture of excitement and awe. Annika was our vision, the mission's eyes and ears to the outside world, and her imagination, fueled by countless hours watching classic 80s horror films, was already painting incredible pictures for her. Sometimes her enthusiasm was infectious, other times a bit draining. Right now, I mostly shared her fascination, albeit with a much larger dose of apprehension. It truly is, Annika, I nodded. A unique phenomenon. Our spectrometers are going crazy trying to analyze these distortions. Declan Byrne, our spark, stood a little way off, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was, as always, unreadable, but I noticed how intently he stared at the dancing line of the Terminator. Years ago, he had lost his wife and young daughter in a horrific car accident back on Earth, a drunk driver in the wrong lane. Since then, he had carried this quiet, profound grief, finding solace only in the flawless logic of machinery. What did he see now in this cosmic ballet of light and darkness? What ghosts of the past were whispering to him from the depths of his memory? I discreetly looked away. My job as a psychologist was to support the crew, not to pick at old wounds unless absolutely necessary. Kenji Sato, our guardian, silently monitored the instrument readings on his console. A former Marine, he had been through several hot zones and valued order and predictability above all else. This planet, with its chaotic Terminator, clearly didn't fit into his worldview. His greatest fear, as I had discovered during pre-flight psychological tests, was not death or pain, but the loss of control, helplessness in the face of an enemy that could not be seen, understood, or defeated by conventional means. Mirage, with its mere appearance, was already challenging his inner fortitude. Captain, Kenji's voice was even and calm. Preliminary surface scans in the proposed landing zone show stable geological activity. Atmospheric pressure at the surface is 0.7 Earth standard. Temperature on the Terminator fluctuates around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Air composition, nitrogen, oxygen, and significant traces of methane and unknown volatile compounds. Respirators are mandatory, but brief exposure without a helmet is possible with filters. Captain Corrigan nodded, her eyes fixed on the main screen where the Terminator writhed like a wounded serpent. Thank you, Kenji. Declan, prep the landing module. Julie and Annika, you're with me in the first group. Kenji, you remain on the Odyssey. Provide overwatch and communications. Scientific curiosity battled with a growing sense of dread within me, a feeling that only intensified as I gazed at this strange, hypnotic planet. Something about these optical illusions was wrong, almost predatory. It was as if the planet itself was trying to lure us in, to mesmerize us with its unearthly dance of light and shadow. I rubbed my temples. Perhaps it was just the effect of the 6-year journey and accumulated fatigue. Yes, that was most likely it. I was a scientist, after all. My job was to observe, analyze, and draw conclusions based on facts, not vague premonitions. But the facts we already had, the missing probes, the strange structures in the last image, did not inspire optimism. Mirage guarded its secrets far too jealously. The descent in the landing module Icarus was surprisingly smooth, aside from the constant light turbulence as we passed through the upper layers of Mirage's dense, methane-heavy atmosphere. Declan Byrne piloted with his usual focused precision, his hands steady on the controls while an orange-red haze raged outside the viewports. Captain Corrigan sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the instruments, while Annika Prasad, pressed against a side window, let out quiet gasps of wonder, commentating on every detail of the changing landscape. I, strapped into my seat, tried to suppress the mild claustrophobia that always crept up on me in the confined space of a lander. It was an old, secret weakness of mine, the result of an unpleasant incident in my youth involving a collapsed cave. I usually managed it by focusing on scientific tasks, but now, approaching this strange, enigmatic planet, the feeling of being squeezed was particularly sharp. We chose a landing site at the very edge of the eternal night, where the last crimson rays of the local sun still clung to the surface before yielding to the impenetrable gloom. The idea was to have access to both the light and dark sides for our research. The Icarus touched down softly on the rocky ground, kicking up a small cloud of reddish dust that settled immediately in the thin air. The engines died, and for a few seconds, an almost absolute silence filled the cabin, broken only by the quiet hum of life support and our own breathing. "Touchdown confirmed," Declan reported. "All systems green. External pressure is 0.68 atmospheres. Temperature is 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Virtually no wind." "Excellent, Declan," the captain nodded. "Prepare for egress. Julian, Annika, suit checks." We quickly verified the integrity of our lightweight expedition suits. The air here was, as predicted, technically breathable through our helmet filters, but protocol demanded full protection for the initial phase. A few minutes later, the Icarus's airlock hissed open, and we stepped onto the surface of Kepler 18-6 F2. The first thing that struck me was the silence. A dead, absolute silence, the kind you only find in a vacuum, even though there was an atmosphere here. Not a breath of wind, not a rustle, not a sound of life. Only the crunch of our boots on the fine, gravel-like soil. The landscape was harsh and desolate. A rocky plain stretched out around us, dotted with boulders of strange, melted shapes, as if they had once been subjected to incredibly high temperatures. The sky above was a murky orange on the side of the setting sun, and charcoal black on the other. And directly in front of us, where light battled darkness, stood the ruins. Even the word ruins seemed too feeble to describe what we saw. These were colossal, cyclopean structures, as if they had grown from the planet itself. Walls of a black, porous stone, similar to obsidian but which didn't reflect light so much as absorb it, soared hundreds of feet into the air. They stretched as far as the eye could see, extending into the illuminated zone and disappearing into the profound darkness of the night side. The architecture was alien, non-human. Gigantic blocks stacked without any visible mortar, forming sharp angles, massive archways, and spiraling towers that seemed to defy gravity. The light-absorbing quality of the material made the ruins appear even more massive and ominous than they were. They oppressed with their sheer mass, their antiquity. We slowly approached. Deep, complex symbols were carved into the surfaces of the black walls. These were not mere scratches or patterns. Each symbol was an intricate network of spirals, angles, and hooked elements that induced an inexplicable feeling of anxiety, almost nausea, if you looked at them for too long. They were unlike any known language or system of writing. It was as if the very geometry of these signs was hostile to human perception. "My God!" Annika breathed, her voice in the comms full of reverent horror. They're enormous. Who could have built this?" Captain Corrigan silently examined the nearest wall. Her face, visible through her helmet's clear visor, was tense. "I don't know yet, Annika. But we're here to find out. Julian, begin sample collection. Annika, deploy the sensor grid. Declan, stay with the lander, monitor the systems, and be ready to cover us." I took out my geological hammer and sample containers. The stone was incredibly hard, but it yielded. After chipping off a few small fragments, I noticed that the material's internal structure was just as porous and light-absorbing. There were no signs of erosion, no indication that these ruins had been abandoned recently. They looked as though they had stood here for millions of years, untouched by time. Awe at the grandeur of the discovery battled within me against a growing sense of alienness and underlying danger. These ruins were not welcoming. They did not invite exploration. They watched in silence, and in their silence there was a hidden threat, especially where they receded into the eternal night. The darkness in the archways and window-like openings seemed dense, almost solid, and I imagined that someone, or something, was watching us from that gloom. I shook my head. My imagination again. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. It only grew with every minute spent in the shadow of these ancient, silent titans. We set up a temporary camp a few hundred feet from the nearest wall of the ruins, on the illuminated side, but close enough to access the border of darkness. The camp consisted of an inflatable habitat module, a small mobile lab, and a perimeter of sensor beacons that Annika Prasad was placing with the enthusiasm of a true pioneer. Declan Byrne, meanwhile, was connecting power cables from the Icarus lander to our small outpost, his movements as precise and economical as ever. Captain Corrigan coordinated our activities, maintaining constant communication with Kenji Sato on the Odyssey. I immersed myself in my work, trying to distract myself from the oppressive atmosphere of this place. The stone samples from the ruins were a complete mystery. Spectral analysis showed the presence of previously unknown elements, and its structure. It was almost organic at a microscopic level, yet it possessed a strength surpassing any natural or synthetic material we knew. We photographed the symbols on the walls, scanned them with lasers, and tried to cross-reference them with any known ancient scripts or mathematical models. All to no avail. They remained mute, alien, as if mocking our attempts to understand them. The first strange occurrences began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Annika, while setting up a distant sensor near the very edge of the illuminated zone, where the shadows from the ruins grew long and distorted, suddenly froze. "Captain?" Her voice on the general comms was a little uncertain. I thought I saw some movement. Out of the corner of my eye, over there, by that archway. We all looked in the direction she indicated. Nothing. Only the black voids of the arches and motionless shadows. "Probably a trick of the light, Annika," Captain Corrigan replied after a short pause. "The optical effects here are very unusual. Stay alert, but don't let your imagination run wild." "Yes, ma'am." "You're probably right." Annika was clearly trying to convince herself. but a note of doubt remained in her voice. An hour or so later, Declan, checking a cable leading to one of the floodlights we'd set up to illuminate our perimeter, got too close to a dark, unlit section of the ruin wall. He stopped, tilting his head as if listening. "Do you hear that?" he asked on a closed channel, addressing the captain and me. "Hear what, Declan?" Corrigan asked. "A kind of scraping sound. Quiet, barely audible, like something large is moving slowly inside, or like someone is whispering." I strained my ears. Nothing but the faint hum of our generators and my own breathing in my helmet. "I don't hear anything, Declan. Could be structural stress in the stone due to the temperature differential, or seismic activity." "Maybe," he said, stepping away from the wall and shaking his head. But the sound was strange. It didn't sound natural. Captain Corrigan also attributed it to acoustic anomalies or fatigue. We had been working for several hours straight, and the local sun, a dim red dwarf, was slowly but surely sinking toward the horizon, casting long, bizarre shadows across the illuminated part of the planet. The atmosphere grew more oppressive with every degree the star descended. The shadows of the ruins stretched, distorted, and took on forms that stirred the imagination. I started to feel as if the ruins themselves were watching us, that the symbols on their walls were pulsing faintly in the weakening light. I took a small portable drill to get a soil sample right at the base of one of the walls, where it met the shadow. As I got closer, I felt a faint chill emanating from the dark stone, unrelated to the ambient temperature. And then I heard it too. Not a scraping, like Declan, but something else. A very low, almost subsonic hum that I felt more with my body than my ears. And with it, a barely perceptible, almost subconscious whisper, composed not of words but of emotions, a feeling of ancient, incomprehensible sorrow and a hidden malevolence. I backed away sharply. "Captain," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I've also registered an acoustic anomaly. A low-frequency hum and some psychoacoustic effects. I recommend we avoid approaching the unlit sections of the ruins for now, unless absolutely necessary." "Acknowledged, Julian," she replied. "It could be related to the ruins' material and its interaction with the planet's magnetic field. Log the data." I did so, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my scientific explanations were just a feeble attempt to rationalize something that defied logic. The equipment, especially the more sensitive sensors, did indeed start to malfunction near the dark side of the ruins. Magnetometer readings were jumping erratically, and gravity sensors showed anomalous fluctuations. Annika reported that some of her sensor beacons, placed closer to the shadows, had stopped transmitting. The red dwarf had almost touched the horizon. The sky to the west blazed with every shade of crimson, while the shadows to the east thickened to absolute black. Our small camp, lit by floodlights, seemed like a tiny island of light in an ocean of encroaching darkness. And this darkness was not just the absence of light. It felt alive, breathing, and full of unspoken threats. The feeling of anxiety was escalating into poorly concealed fear. I looked at my companions. Captain Corrigan's and Declan's faces were tense, and Annika kept glancing nervously at the darkening ruins, her usual enthusiasm replaced by poorly hidden trepidation. We all felt it. Mirage was preparing to show us its true nature, and that nature dwelled in the dark. The last crimson ray of the local sun, like a final bloody brushstroke, slid across the peaks of the Cyclopean ruins and sank below the horizon. Almost instantly, darkness fell, a thick, viscous, absolute darkness. Our camp, illuminated by bright LED floodlights, became a tiny, trembling island of light in an ocean of impenetrable gloom. The lit portion of the ruins, which just minutes before had seemed ancient but understandable, now looked sinister in the harsh artificial light, casting deep, dancing shadows. And the part that had always been in darkness became utterly impenetrable, as if there were nothing behind it but primordial void, or something immeasurably worse. The silence, already oppressive, became almost physically palpable, pressing on our eardrums. The only sounds were the steady hum of the generator powering our camp and our own ragged breathing over the comms. "Everyone stay calm," Captain Corrigan's voice sounded strained but firm in our headsets. "We stick to the plan. Annika, check the perimeter. Declan, monitor the generator. Julian, continue sample analysis in the mobile lab. Maintain constant communication." I nodded, though no one could see it, and headed for the small inflatable dome of the mobile lab. It was cramped, but familiar inside. I laid out the rock and soil samples and switched on the analyzers. The steady whir of the instruments was somewhat calming, creating an illusion of control, of normalcy. But it was just that. An illusion. The sense of unease that had plagued me since we landed had now grown into outright dread. Something was wrong. Something had changed with the onset of darkness. The air in the lab, despite the working filters, felt stale and heavy. Declan Byrne was tinkering with the generator, located a few dozen feet from the main habitat. I could see his figure in the floodlight, bent over the control panel. Suddenly, he straightened up sharply, recoiling. "Declan, what is it?" The captain reacted immediately. Silence, then a ragged, choked gasp. "Nothing. Nothing, Cap. Thought I saw a reflection on the panel, just fatigue." His voice sounded strange, hollow. I saw him rub his face with his hand, then bend back over the generator, but his movements were no longer as steady. Later, when we reviewed the logs from his personal recorder, if that word can even apply to what we endured, we saw what he saw. For a fleeting moment, in the polished metal surface of the control panel, instead of his own reflection, he saw the small, pale face of a girl with huge, tear-filled eyes and a thin trickle of blood running from the corner of her mouth. The face of his deceased daughter, Lily. And that face was silently moving its lips, forming the words, "Daddy, why didn't you save us?" The vision vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving Declan with a hammering heart and a cold sweat on his back. He dismissed it as stress, a trick of the light, his own grief that never let him go. But the seed of terror had been planted. Meanwhile, I was trying to focus on analyzing the samples. I switched on the electron microscope to examine the structure of the mysterious black stone. The magnified images appeared on the screen, and I froze. The pores in the stone, which had previously seemed chaotic, now appeared to be arranging themselves into ordered, repeating patterns, resembling the same ominous symbols that covered the ruin walls. And was it my imagination, or were they faintly pulsing? Suddenly, the walls of the mobile lab, made of a strong, reinforced polymer, began to contract. Not an illusion, I could feel it. The air became thick, viscous, difficult to breathe. Cold, clammy panic seized me. My old claustrophobia, dormant for years, awoke with a new, terrifying force. The walls were pressing in, the ceiling was lowering. I felt my chest constrict, my lungs starving for oxygen. Gasping, I desperately scrambled for the exit, bumping into a rack of equipment and knocking over several test tubes. The zipper on the airlock jammed. I fought with it, consumed by animalistic terror, feeling the walls about to crush me. Finally, the zipper gave way, and I literally tumbled outside into the cold, thin air of Mirage, greedily gulping for oxygen. I lay on the rocky ground, breathing heavily, my heart pounding. Around me, everything was the same. The floodlights brightly illuminated the camp. The generator hummed steadily. Captain Corrigan and Annika were looking at me with bewilderment. "Julian, what happened? Are you all right?" The captain's voice was filled with concern. I got to my trembling feet and looked at the mobile lab. It stood there as if nothing had happened, its walls taut as they should be, no sign of deformation. I don't know," I rasped, still trying to catch my breath. "I thought, the walls, they were closing in." Captain Corrigan came over, looking closely into my eyes, then at the lab. "A pressure surge, maybe? Or, Julian, are you sure it wasn't a hallucination?" I finished for her. "I'm a psychologist, Captain." I know what hallucinations feel like. This felt real. I could feel them pressing down. But even as I said it, a note of uncertainty crept into my voice. My own mind was rebelling against such an explanation. From that moment on, the line between reality and illusion began to blur rapidly for all of us. Fear, which had been mere background noise until now, began to seep into every crack of our consciousness, poisoning our thoughts, distorting our perception. The darkness surrounding the camp no longer seemed like just an absence of light. It was alive, watching, and it had begun to play with us, dragging our most hidden nightmares to the surface. The setting of the physical sun on Mirage marked the sunset of our sanity. The horror didn't arrive gradually, building like a tide. It crashed down on us suddenly, like an avalanche, burying the remnants of our rationality and self-control. It was as if an unseen conductor had waved his baton, and a symphony of nightmares began to play at full volume, using our own minds as its instruments. Annika Prasad, our vision, was the first to suffer the full-scale assault. She had volunteered to check a sensor beacon on the far perimeter, one that had started transmitting garbled data. It was about 100 yards from the main habitat, closer to the dark wall of the ruins, where the shadows from our floodlights grew long and ghostly. We heard her calm report over the radio as she approached the beacon. Then her voice was suddenly cut short by a scream. Not just a cry of fear, it was a shriek of primal, animalistic terror. "Annika, report! What's happening?" Captain Corrigan barked into her mic, her face instantly hardening. In response, we only heard Annika's ragged, panicked breathing and a strange, shuffling sound in the background. Then her choked voice, full of tears and horror. He's here! He's behind me! Help me!" "Who's there, Annika? Describe it!" I yelled, trying to keep my composure even as my heart dropped into my stomach. "The mask, the cleaver, he's real." Her voice broke into a sob. A cleaver? A mask? I remembered her passion for 80s slasher films. Could it be? It was insane, but her terror was all too real. "Kenji, Orbital, do you have a visual from her helmet cam?" the captain requested. "Negative, Cap," Kenji replied from the Odyssey, his voice tense. "Interference." Heavy interference from Sharma's entire sector. I'm losing her signal. The captain and I grabbed emergency kits and pulse rifles and sprinted toward where Annika had disappeared. Declan remained to cover the camp, his face pale but resolute. We ran, stumbling over rocks, our flashlights snatching distorted shadows of the ruins from the darkness. And then we saw her. Annika was darting between the giant black blocks like a cornered animal. And behind her, relentlessly, with an unnatural, fluid gait, moved a tall, dark figure. The figure wore a crude, white, emotionless mask, and in its hand, it clutched a huge cleaver, covered in rust and something dark like dried blood. It looked exactly like the maniac from one of those old movies Annika loved. But this was no actor in a costume. The figure's movements were too smooth, too purposeful, and the aura of menace emanating from it was almost tangible. "Annika!" the captain shouted. The masked figure paused for a moment, turning its head toward us. The empty eye sockets of the mask seemed to bore into us. Then it resumed its pursuit of Annika, ignoring us. "Halt! Do not move!" Corrigan yelled, raising her rifle. I did the same. But when we tried to aim, the figure seemed to flicker. It became translucent, distorted, like an image on a bad screen. Annika tripped and fell. The figure was upon her, raising the cleaver. Annika screamed, shielding herself with her arms. We fired. The pulse charges passed straight through the figure without harming it, striking the ruin wall behind it and knocking a shower of sparks from the black stone. But Annika screamed in pain. On her arm, where the illusory cleaver should have passed, a dark stain of blood was spreading. The pain was real. The wound was real. At the same time, shouts and sounds of a struggle erupted from the camp. We heard Declan's voice, full of rage and despair, followed by gunshots. "Declan, what's your status?" the captain yelled into her radio as we tried to distract the masked figure from Annika. It attacked! Garrett! He turned!" Declan's voice was breaking. Garrett was one of the technicians who had stayed with him at the camp. Corrigan and I exchanged a look. The horror was escalating with every second. If we split up, we'd be condemning someone to certain death. The captain made an instant decision. "Julian, get Annika, I'm going to Declan." And without a second thought, she raced back toward the camp. I ran to Annika, who was sobbing, clutching her injured arm. The masked figure started moving toward her again. I stood between them, aiming my rifle. "Get back!" I shouted, though I knew how futile it was. The figure froze for a moment, as if studying me. Then it slowly raised its cleaver. At that moment, by some strange coincidence, the flashlight mounted on my helmet flickered and died. I was left in the gloom, illuminated only by the light from the distant camp floodlights and the reflected light from Annika's helmet. And in that twilight, the masked figure became even more real, even more threatening. Meanwhile, Kenji Sato, our guardian in orbit, who until this point could only watch helplessly through scraps of video and audio feeds, was experiencing his own nightmare. While trying to restore communications and understand what was happening on the surface, he suddenly saw on one of the monitors displaying the Odyssey's interior that his assistant, a young technician named Bryce, began to convulse strangely. Bryce's eyes rolled back, his skin broke out in deathly mottles, and a dark, thick fluid poured from his mouth. A second later, Bryce lunged at the camera with an inhuman snarl, and the feed went dead. Kenji realized he wasn't safe in orbit. He realized this creature, or whatever it was, could act at a distance if you were connected to Mirage. He had always dismissed zombie movies as lowbrow fiction, but now a living nightmare from those films was trying to break down the door to his control room on the Odyssey. Kenji, a veteran of countless combat operations, was face to face with an enemy that obeyed no laws of logic or physics, an enemy born from the depths of the subconscious. His greatest fear, the loss of control, had materialized in the worst way imaginable. On the planet, in the ruins, I watched the masked figure raise its cleaver over me. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the blow. But instead I heard Declan's furious cry, followed by a blinding flash and a crackle. I opened my eyes. Declan was standing a few yards away, holding some kind of modified tool that had just unleashed an electrical discharge, striking the figure directly. The figure flickered, distorted like static on a screen, and vanished. It simply dissolved into the air. "Julian, Annika, are you okay?" Declan was breathing heavily, his face covered in sweat and grime. "Yeah, I think so," I mumbled, helping Annika to her feet. "What was that?" "I don't know," Declan shook his head. "But Garrett, he's dead." "That thing, It just tore him apart. We were in the heart of a nightmare, and it was only just beginning. We struggled back to the main habitat, supporting a weeping Annika whose arm was bleeding despite a hastily applied bandage. Captain Corrigan was already there, her face pale and grim. Near the generator, on the ground, lay the body of Garrett, or what was left of it. The sight was horrific, and I involuntarily looked away. Declan recounted in a short, choked voice how the technician had suddenly started convulsing, his eyes turning white, before lunging at Declan with inhuman strength, snarling and biting like a rabid animal. Declan had to use his improvised taser to stop him, but it was too late. "Comms to the Odyssey." Captain Corrigan's voice was sharp as she bent over the communications console. "Kenji! Kenji, respond." In response, only the crackle of static came from the speakers, through which strange, distorted voices could be heard. They whispered, overlapping one another, merging into a horrifying chorus. I thought I heard the captain's name, spoken with an accusatory tone. The words betrayal, death, it's your fault. Corrigan slammed her fist on the panel. "Damn it! They're jamming us, or something's happened on board." Her gaze darted to the dark ruins, as if she expected to see the source of all our troubles there. The atmosphere in the module became unbearably tense. Fear, which had been an external enemy, now began to seep inside, poisoning our minds, sowing distrust. Every rustle, every shadow made us jump. We were trapped, cut off from the outside world, surrounded by a hostile, incomprehensible force. Suddenly, Declan, who had been silently watching Captain Corrigan, let out a wild cry and recoiled from her, holding his hands out. "Stay away. Don't come near me, Fiona. Fiona." That was his late wife's name. "Declan, it's me, Isabel." The captain tried to calm him, but there was alarm in her voice. "What's wrong with you?" You're not Fiona." Declan's eyes darted around wildly. "You're a ghost." "You've come to blame me. Get out." He grabbed a heavy wrench from a table, his face contorted with rage and grief. I realized what was happening. Illusions, projections. They had gotten to Declan too, playing on his deepest wound, his guilt over his family's death. He wasn't seeing Captain Corrigan. He was seeing the bloodied ghost of his wife, summoned from the depths of his subconscious. "Declan, stop!" I stepped forward, trying to speak as calmly as possible, though my own heart was pounding. "Look at me. It's Captain Corrigan. It's an illusion, Declan. They're playing with your mind." But he couldn't hear me. He advanced on the captain, brandishing the wrench. Corrigan backed away, trying to reason with him, but fear was already flickering in her eyes. A few more seconds, and the irreparable would happen. At that moment, overcoming my own terror and the lingering claustrophobia that still pressed down on me from the incident in the lab, I did what a psychologist had to do. I stepped between them, directly under Declan's raised wrench. "Declan, it's me, Julian. Remember, we're on Mirage. Your family? They're safe where they are now. It wasn't your fault." I looked him straight in the eyes, trying to break through the veil of nightmare that had enveloped his mind. The wrench froze a few inches from my head. For a moment, a flicker of recognition crossed Declan's eyes. Then agony, a struggle. He was breathing heavily, his gaze darting between me and Captain Corrigan, who was frozen, unable to move. "Fiona, I'm sorry," he whispered, and the wrench fell from his weakened hand, clattering to the floor. Declan collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Annika, who had been watching the scene in horror, suddenly cried out and pointed a trembling hand at me. "Dr. Adler, your face, it's changing." I looked at her, confused. My face? What was wrong with it? Tentacles, eyes, like that thing from the movie. Her voice was full of disgust and fear. I touched my face. Normal skin, But Annika wasn't seeing me. She was seeing one of those Lovecraftian horrors with countless eyes and writhing tentacles that, as I knew, had haunted her childhood nightmares after watching some old horror film. The projections weren't just creating individual nightmares, they were distorting our perception of each other, sowing discord and mutual distrust. We were becoming monsters in each other's eyes. Outside, beyond the thin walls of the module, the ruins seemed to come alive. The symbols on their black walls began to pulse with a dim, sickly light, red, green, violet, forming images specific to each of our fears. The shadows moved unnaturally, stretching, taking on grotesque, monstrous forms. I saw one of the shadows from our floodlight transform into a giant spider, slowly crawling up the ruin wall, its multiple eyes glowing red. My arachnophobia, not as severe as my claustrophobia but still present, made me shudder. Communication with the Odyssey and Kenji Sato was never restored. We were alone, trapped on this damned planet where reality itself had become our enemy. The lander's onboard systems began to fail one by one. Navigation, communications, even the life support system was malfunctioning. Calling for help was impossible. Using our equipment was becoming increasingly difficult. Paranoia enveloped us like a sticky web. Each of us was fighting our own demons, and in that fight, we were ceasing to trust one another. Captain Corrigan, despite all her efforts to maintain control, looked exhausted and lost. Declan sat in a corner, his head in his hands, muttering incoherently. Annika was crying, huddled under a table, her eyes wide with terror. I knew that if we didn't find a way to fight this, we would destroy each other, deceived by nightmarish visions, long before the projections themselves did it. Our small team was falling apart, and the darkness of Mirage was closing in, ready to consume us completely. Several hours passed, filled with a fitful, anxious sleep, if one could even call it that. Every noise, every dancing shadow from the malfunctioning floodlights made us flinch, anticipating a new assault on our frayed nerves. The nightmares didn't fully retreat. They merely lay in wait, like predators giving their prey a brief respite before the final pounce. I saw Declan jolt awake time and again, his eyes wide with terror, and heard Annika muttering the names of characters from her favorite horror films in her sleep, mixing them with pleas for help. Even Captain Corrigan, that rock of self-control, looked gaunt, her face drawn, with deep shadows under her eyes. I tried to analyze. It was the only thing keeping me afloat, preventing me from sinking completely into the abyss of madness. Psychoempathic projections, entities that fed on fear. They had no physical form, but their effect on our consciousness was absolutely real, causing real physiological reactions, pain, bleeding, perhaps even death from a heart attack or suffocation in an illusory trap. Garrett was horrifying proof of that. His body, lying under a makeshift shroud by the generator, was no illusion. "We can't stay here." My voice sounded hoarse in the module's silence. Everyone looked at me. They're playing with us, draining us. If we stay here, we'll die, either at their hands or at each other's. "And what do you suggest, Julian?" Captain Corrigan asked wearily. "Comms are down. The Icarus is barely functional. Where would we go?" "To the source," I said, surprising myself with my sudden resolve. "They're projecting from somewhere." I nodded towards the dark, impenetrable section of the ruins that began just a few hundred yards from our camp. "In there, deep inside those ruins, there has to be something. Some focal point for their power. If we can find it, maybe we can destroy it, or at least understand what we're dealing with." My words hung in the air. The idea was insane. To voluntarily walk into the very heart of the darkness, the source of this nightmare, seemed like suicide. But the alternative, a slow, agonizing demise in this illuminated patch of madness, was even worse. Declan raised his head. In his eyes, alongside the pain and fear, I saw a flicker of his former determination. The doc's right, Cap. Sitting here is just waiting to die, if there's even the slightest chance. We have to try. His voice was still weak, but there was steel in it. Having lost everything he held dear, he seemed to have found a kind of desperate courage. Annika was silent, her face pale, but she slowly nodded. Even she, the youngest and most terrified among us, understood there was no other way out. Captain Corrigan looked at us for a long time, then at the dark ruins. Finally, she took a deep breath. All right, gear up. We take only the essentials. Weapons, lights, medkits. We go together. No one gets left behind. If anyone feels the visions starting, you report it immediately. We gathered our gear quickly. A few pulse rifles, which we had already learned were useless against the projections, but might be necessary against each other if someone lost control again. High-powered flashlights, spare batteries, a small supply of water and nutrient bars. My own medical kit, which now seemed like a mockery. How could I treat wounds inflicted by one's own imagination? We stepped out of the module into the twilight, if a planet like this could even be said to have a dawn. The local red dwarf had not yet breached the horizon, but the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, turning a dirty gray. The darkness within the ruins, however, had not become any less dense. It seemed to resist the approaching light. We moved toward the nearest opening in the wall, one that led into the unlit section. The closer we got, the stronger the oppressive feeling became. The air was colder here, and I once again heard that low-frequency hum I had sensed earlier, only now it was louder, more insistent. The symbols on the walls, even in the gloom, seemed to writhe and pulse like living things. Remember, Captain Corrigan's voice was tense. These could be illusions. Hold on to reality. Trust your instruments if they're working, and trust each other while you still can. We stepped into the darkness. Inside, the ruins were a labyrinth of giant halls, narrow corridors, and collapsed passages. The darkness was nearly absolute, our flashlight beams carving out only small patches of the black, light-absorbing walls. And the nightmares returned. Declan saw his daughter again, running ahead of him, luring him into dark chasms, her laughter echoing off the walls. He tried to chase after her several times, and it took all of the captain's and my strength to hold him back. Annika saw giant insects, her personal phobia, crawling out of the shadows, and she screamed several times, firing at unseen enemies. I saw the corridors narrowing, the ceilings lowering, threatening to crush me. My claustrophobia returned with a vengeance, and I had to exert an inhuman effort to keep moving forward instead of curling up in a corner to wait for the end. But this time, we were prepared. We warned each other, supported each other, pulled each other from the clutches of the illusions. It's not real, Declan. She's not here. Annika, look, it's just a shadow. Julian, breathe. The corridor is wide. You can do it. It was a desperate, exhausting battle, not just with an external enemy, but with our own minds. And yet, we pressed deeper. The ruins grew stranger, the architecture more alien. We passed through a vast hall whose ceiling was lost in darkness, its floor covered in a layer of some viscous, dark substance like hardened tar. And here, the symbols on the walls glowed with a particular brightness, their pulsation becoming almost painful to look at. It was in this hall that we found it. In the very center, on a low dais, stood something that resembled an altar or a complex device, constructed from the same black, light-absorbing material. It was shaped like a multifaceted star, and from it emanated the low-frequency hum, now almost deafening. The symbols on its surface glowed with an intense light, as if this were the heart of the entire damned system. We all understood at the same time. This was the source, the focus, the amplifier. From here, the psycho-empathic projections spread their poison. And it was here, in this hall, surrounded by dancing shadows and the whispers of our own fears, that we would have to make our last stand, or die trying. A sense of desperate resolve mixed with primal terror. We were standing before the heart of darkness, and it was beating in time with our most intimate nightmares. The moment we approached the black, star-shaped altar in the center of the hall, the psycho-empathic projections crashed down on us with a new, tenfold fury. It was as if the very core of their power sensed a threat and mobilized all its resources to break us for good. The darkness in the hall thickened, becoming almost tangible, and the hum emanating from the altar turned into a low-frequency vibration that penetrated to the bone, causing nausea and dizziness. A wave of claustrophobia washed over me again. The walls of the hall began to shift ominously, the ceiling to descend. I saw giant stone blocks moving slowly but inexorably toward each other, threatening to crush us. The air grew heavy. I was suffocating, even though the indicators in my helmet showed a normal oxygen level. I fell to my knees, trying to fight the panic, but the illusion was too strong, too real. "Julian, fight it! It's not real!" Captain Corrigan's voice reached me through the haze of terror. I struggled to lift my head. The captain was standing with her feet planted wide, her face contorted with strain, but she wasn't backing down. Ghostly figures flickered before her. I recognized fragments of her past she never spoke of. Fallen comrades from previous missions, their faces full of accusation. But she was looking through them, her gaze locked on the altar. "They're illusions, Julian. They feed on our fear. Don't give it to them." Her words, spoken with such force of will, sobered me slightly. I'm a psychologist. I know how fear works. I know how it distorts perception. Focus on reality, I told myself. Breathe. It's just a hall, a big, empty hall. I forced myself to look at Declan and Annika. Declan stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the altar. But what he was seeing wasn't just black stone. Before him, on top of the altar, lay two small bodies covered by a white sheet, his wife and daughter. And from under the sheet, thin, pale hands were reaching for him, beckoning him closer. "Come to us, Daddy. We're so lonely here," a child's voice whispered, sending a chill down my spine. Declan took a step forward, then another, his face devoid of all expression, as if he were in a trance. Annika was screaming. All around her, the monsters from her favorite horror movies were materializing from the shadows. The masked figure with the cleaver, a grotesque clown with balloons, a creature with long claws rising from the floor. They surrounded her, closing in, their grotesque faces twisting into malevolent grins. Annika was firing her pulse rifle, but the charges passed harmlessly through the monsters. "Declan, no! It's a trap!" I shouted, trying to get to my feet. Captain Corrigan, seeing that Declan was about to succumb to the illusion, did the only thing she could. She fired. Not at Declan. At the altar. The pulse charge struck one of the points of the black star. A deafening crack echoed through the hall, and sparks flew. For a moment, all the illusions around us wavered, distorting like a damaged image on a screen. The figures tormenting the captain recoiled. The monsters around Annika flickered and became translucent. Even Declan's vision on the altar faded for a second. "Fire on the altar!" the captain shouted. "It's their focus! We have to destroy it!" Her words snapped Declan back to reality. Seeing his vision falter, he let out a furious roar, raised his rifle, and opened fire on the altar. I joined them, shooting wildly, trying to hit the cursed structure. Annika, seeing her monsters weaken, also turned her attention to the altar. Our pulse charges slammed into the black stone, chipping off small pieces and sending sparks flying, but the altar was incredibly durable. And with every hit we landed, the illusions around us grew more ferocious, as if the entities knew we had found their weak spot and were throwing their last reserves at us. The shadows in the hall began to dance, stretching into giant, formless shapes with burning eyes. The walls began to close in again, this time accompanied by a deafening, grinding sound. The symbols on the walls and the altar itself flared with an unbearably bright, painful light. I could feel my mind starting to slip again. Fear, despair, hopelessness. These emotions washed over me, threatening to drown me. And then Declan did something completely unexpected. He threw down his rifle, grabbed a heavy multi-tool from his belt, a sort of hybrid crowbar and plasma cutter, and charged at the altar with a yell. "Declan, no! It's too dangerous!" the captain shouted. But he wasn't listening. He ran to the altar and brought his tool down on it with all his might. There was a deafening crack. One of the points of the black star fractured. A burst of dark energy erupted from the crack, throwing Declan several feet back. He collapsed and didn't move. "Declan!" Annika rushed to his side, but his desperate act had had an effect. The illusions around us wavered again, this time more violently. The shadows retreated, the monsters around Annika almost vanished. The walls stopped moving. Even the hum grew quieter. "He damaged it," the captain cried. "Keep firing." The captain and I focused our fire on the crack. Each shot widened it, breaking off more pieces of the black stone. And with each piece, the illusions weakened. I could feel the grip of terror on my mind loosening. I could think clearly again. Breathe. Suddenly, the altar shuddered. A blinding flash of light erupted from the crack, but it wasn't a warm, living light. It was cold and dead, like the light of distant stars. A piercing, inhuman shriek followed, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shriek was full of pain, fury, and hunger. And then everything went silent. The light from the crack died. The symbols on the walls and the altar stopped pulsing, becoming mere patterns carved in stone. The shadows returned to their places. The hum was gone. We stood in the middle of the vast, dark hall, breathing heavily. The illusions were gone. The nightmares had retreated. All that was left was us, three exhausted, terrified but living people, and the still body of Declan at the foot of the shattered altar. The battle for our souls, it seemed, was won. But at what cost? The silence that fell after the deafening shriek and flash of light was almost as unbearable as the nightmare that preceded it. It was heavy, ringing in our ears, filled with unspoken questions and the bitter taste of victory, if it could even be called that. The illusions were gone, that much was clear. The shadows no longer danced, the walls no longer shifted, and the air, though still cold and stale, no longer pressed down on our lungs. The ruins were once again just ruins, ancient, alien, but only stone. Annika was already beside Declan, leaning over him. I hurried to them, my heart sinking with a terrible premonition. Captain Corrigan remained by the shattered altar, her pulse rifle still aimed at it, as if expecting another attack. Declan lay on his back, his eyes closed, his face ashen. On his chest, where the main blast of dark energy from the altar must have hit, was a large, charred hole in his suit. I knelt, fumbling to find a pulse on his neck. My fingers were trembling. Is he breathing?" Annika's voice was a bare whisper, full of tears and hope. I shook my head. There was no pulse, not the slightest sign of life. Declan Byrne, our spark, the man who could fix anything, the man who in a desperate charge had dealt the decisive blow to the source of our torment, was dead. He had sacrificed himself to give us a chance. His final battle wasn't for machines, but for our souls, and he had won it at the cost of his own life. I slowly stood up. Annika broke down, burying her face in the shoulder of Declan's lifeless body. Captain Corrigan walked over to us, her face unreadable, but her eyes held a pain so deep it unsettled me. She silently knelt beside Declan, touching his cheek for a moment. "We have to go," she said quietly, rising. Before they come back. If they even can. We didn't know if this was a final victory. Had we destroyed the source completely, or just temporarily deactivated it? There were no answers. But we couldn't stay here, in this heart of darkness. The journey back out of the ruins felt like an eternity, though we were no longer hindered by illusions. We walked in silence, each lost in thought. The weight of Declan's loss pressed down on us as heavily as the nightmares had before. We left his body there, at the foot of the shattered altar. We had neither the strength nor the means to take him with us. It was another burden we would have to carry. When we finally emerged from the dark corridors onto the side of the ruins, where dawn was faintly breaking, we stopped, stunned. The local red dwarf was slowly rising above the horizon, its dim crimson rays painting the sky and the rocky plain in ghostly colors. It was the first real dawn we had seen on this planet without distortion or fear, and it was beautiful in its harsh, alien way. But its beauty brought no joy, only a dull, aching pain. Our camp was a wreck. The Icarus lander was tilted, its hull pocked with strange, melted marks. The generator was silent. Garrett's body was still where we had left it, covered by a tarp. It felt like a lifetime had passed since we had left this fragile island of civilization. "Comms," the captain muttered, heading for the Icarus. "We have to try to contact the Odyssey. If Kenji is still alive." We followed her. Inside the lander, chaos reigned. Many instruments were smashed, control panels melted, but the main communications console seemed to have survived. Captain Corrigan, pushing aside debris, leaned over it, her fingers flying across the keypad. Several agonizing minutes of waiting. The crackle of static. And then... Odyssey, this is Icarus. Captain Corrigan, do you copy?" More static. And then suddenly, through the interference, a weak, distorted but achingly familiar voice. "Icarus! Captain, my God, you're alive! I thought I'd lost you all." Tears of relief welled in my eyes. Kenji was alive. The Odyssey was in orbit. We had a chance. "Kenji, we have casualties." The captain's voice trembled. Declan's gone. Garrett too. There are 3 of us left. Prepare for emergency evacuation. The Icarus is damaged. We can't achieve liftoff. The rest was a blur. The rescue shuttle from the Odyssey, piloted by Kenji himself. The heavy ascent to orbit. The silence aboard the ship as we left Mirage's orbit. None of us looked at the screens showing the receding planet, the place that had become a grave for our comrades, and the source of wounds that would never heal. We had survived, 3 out of 5, exhausted, on the brink of madness but alive. Mirage had let us go, but we carried a remnant of it with us, its cold breath in our souls. Was this the dawn of a new life? Or were we forever prisoners of the eternal darkness we had endured? I didn't know the answer. I only knew one thing. We would never be the same again. The journey home aboard the Odyssey was long and agonizing. Not because of the distance or any ship malfunctions. Kenji Sato, despite the nightmare he had endured in orbit, which he spoke of reluctantly, mentioning only temporary system interference and some perceptual anomalies, kept the Odyssey in perfect condition. What was agonizing was the silence. A silence filled with the shadows of the past, the faces of our fallen comrades, the echo of that inhuman shriek from the shattered altar. we were placed in the Hippocrates quarantine station on the edge of the solar system. Endless medical tests, psychological evaluations, debriefings by the Explorer Corps' internal security. We told our story again and again, but each time we were met with a wall of polite disbelief or poorly concealed horror. How do you explain psychoempathic projections to someone who wasn't there? How do you describe a terror that has no physical form but is capable of killing? The official report on the Odyssey mission to Kepler 186 F2 was classified top secret with a designation of existential level threat. The planet Mirage was declared a Class 1 restricted zone. All travel to its system was strictly forbidden. It was as if someone in the high command actually believed us, or, at the very least, was scared enough not to take any chances. The three of us, Captain Isabel Corrigan, Annika Prasad, and I, Dr. Julian Adler, underwent a long course of psychological rehabilitation. We were prescribed powerful medications, subjected to hypnotherapy sessions, all in an attempt to erase or at least dull the memories. But Mirage didn't let go that easily. The nightmares came every night. Over and over, I dreamt of the contracting walls, the dark corridors of the ruins, the shattered altar, and Declan's empty, lifeless face. Sometimes, in the dim light of my own room, I thought the shadows on the walls were moving unnaturally, forming into sinister glyphs. I would hear faint whispers at the edge of hearing whenever I was alone. I knew it was post-traumatic stress, my mind playing tricks on me. But the knowledge brought no comfort. Captain Corrigan retired. She couldn't fly anymore. I saw her a few times after the rehabilitation. She had aged 10 years. Her eyes, once full of fire and determination, were now hollow and weary. She lived alone in a small house by the sea and rarely went outside. Annika tried to return to a normal life. She even got a job in the Corps archives, sorting old data. I visited her once. She was sitting in front of a computer screen, watching one of those old 80s horror movies, the kind she had loved so much before Mirage. But now, there was no trace of her former excited glee. She stared at the screen with a kind of dull, chilling anxiety, as if she expected the monsters on screen to step into reality at any moment. In the reflection on the monitor, for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a distorted, unnaturally elongated shadow behind her. I blinked, and it was gone. Or had I just imagined it? I returned to my psychology practice, but I could no longer work with ordinary patients. Their fears and anxieties seemed so small, so insignificant compared to what we had endured. I began to specialize in working with those who, like us, had encountered the unexplained in the depths of space. There weren't many of them, but they existed. And in their eyes, I saw the same vacant imprint that had taken root in my own soul. Sometimes, late at night, alone in my office, I review the classified reports from the Odyssey, the final sensor readings, taken as we departed from Mirage. And there, among the standard data, is one faint anomaly, a weak, almost imperceptible psychoempathic signature, very similar to the one that emanated from the altar. And that signal, according to the calculations, was slowly but surely following our return course, as if a fragment of Mirage, a tiny vestige of its forgotten nightmares, was trailing us. The evil wasn't destroyed, it was only dormant. And perhaps it was still looking for a way to reach us, or someone else, because the universe is full of not only stars and planets, but also ancient, incomprehensible horrors that bide their time in the darkness beyond the horizon. And sometimes they find us.